Let's start with a quote. "Our ideas grow old with us. That is why we pay no particular attention to them. And we are quite astonished at younger minds not falling in love with them in their turn, as we do." It is customary to begin a paper with a quotation that applies to one's topic directly, or at least analogically. Moved by contrariness, I believe Michael Paul Gallagher would have enjoyed, I have chosen to do the opposite. Let me explain. Most of us plod along with one or two ideas at most, as Karl Rahner memorably put it, leading us to that quick obsolescence that seals the fate of electronic devices today. Father Gallagher's thought, by contrast, demonstrates a remarkable freshness, which I believe it will keep. To pursue the geek's metaphor, I believe his thought is self-upgrading. Why? In great part because he was constantly on the move, summoning a variety of authors and topics that few of us could match, and making them talk to one another. Now, the obvious risk of such an approach, and one he did not avoid entirely, is eclecticism. But the dogged determination with which he decided to dive deeper to get to know human life and human life with God is quite exceptional. And that will make his thought live on in many explicit and implicit ways. Given his love for John Henry Newman's university sermon called Implicit and Explicit Reason, I think Michael Paul would be even more satisfied with humbly fueling other people's research work and beliefs, rather than with being republished himself for the 10th time. One of his favorite wishes for people and for cultures he drew precisely from Newman, that they would enlarge their mind. He also often pointed out that Pope Benedict XVI had invited our postmodern culture to a similar experience of broadening the concept of reason. Now, these are parallel expressions to the title of Gallagher's 2001 book, Dive Deeper, The Human Poetry of Faith, which inspired the organizers of this conference in choosing a name. Enlarging the mind, broadening reason, diving deeper, all three expressions point to change, progress, growth, and dynamism. And I think that herein lies the key to the attractiveness and discreet staying power of Gallagher's thought. I'd like to explore this with you now in 3 points. The first will be more biographical, grasping how Michael Paul's exploration of vaster geographic, cultural, literary, and theological horizons sustained his own growth and change. The second point will summon great friends that Father Gallagher made along the way, friends who matched his dynamism and fueled it, and whom he loved to introduce to other people. The final point will identify subcurrents of the main tow pulling us out to sea to meet the God who walks on waters and who bids us to trust him. First point, living beyond limits. In Roots and Horizons, the epilogue to Clashing Symbols, Gallagher recounts how in middle age he revisited the village of his childhood, Colloquium, County Sligo, in the northwest of Ireland. He comments, as he did in several other books, on how closely knit the culture of his childhood had been. "We were as Danes in Denmark all day long" is a line from Wallace Stevens, to which Gallagher turned time and again to describe the traditional Catholic Irish culture of his youth. It is no surprise, then, that his gap year in France as a 20-year-old student of literature came as a cultural and religious shock. Atheists and non-believers, for the first time almost, were very real, and perhaps not as evil or disagreeable as the Irish boy had been brought up to believe. Love for a French girl, to which Michael Paul discreetly alludes in his posthumous book, Into Extra Time, doubtless added depth to his experience. Joining the Jesuit novitiate certainly took him to new places, both spiritually and culturally, and then his pursuit of literary studies as a Jesuit, eventually focusing on George Herbert, led him to know and love many other poets, playwrights, and novelists, a growth furthered by over 10 years of teaching literature at University College Dublin. Dr. Gallagher's academic service to his students often took on a deeper human and spiritual dimension, bringing them jointly to expand the horizons of their faith and culture. Later trips to India and Latin America did this in a different way, removing social blinders and religious prejudices. The new major turn in his life was the unexpected call here to Rome to work for the Secretariat for Non-Believers, later the Pontifical Council for Culture. Padre Gallagher used this new opportunity not only to benefit from the Vatican's international character, but also to make several deep and lasting friendships with local Italians. Professor Gallagher eventually returned to academic life, but now here at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, which led him once again to stretch his knowledge of theologians and expand his geographical and cultural horizons as he met a younger, postmodern, more diverse student body, staff, and faculty. Finally, Michael Paul's third encounter with cancer unexpectedly brought him home to Ireland. Into Extra Time reveals how much he reveled in returning to his own culture, having been exposed to so many others, although he recognized how much it had changed, and not always for the better. But what was there was there. Sweet Irish banter from friends and soft-spoken care from nurses lent new light to his last months, with an ever-growing sense of wonder and at-one-ment as he moved towards the threshold. Second point, a host of friends. It would be a daunting task to size up exactly how many poets, playwrights, pundits, philosophers, and theologians Gallagher introduces to his readers. Most of his works are short, some even tend toward the aphoristic. The feeling at times is one of being taken through a large party by a gracious host who helpfully stands by your side and introduces you to new people. In this vein, some guests stand out more prominently. I suppose each one of you here at the conference would mingle with a different group of Gallagher's friends. My own crowd might include John Henry Newman and William Lynch among theologians, and Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, and Flannery O'Connor among the literati. Most of these guests are giants precisely because they have accepted the challenge to move beyond their comfort zones. These authors struck Gallagher's fancy, or more accurately, his imagination, his trust, and his faith. Now, if I just moved from the word fancy to the word imagination in this last sentence, it is because Gallagher's choice of partners in dialogue was never a mere whim, but rather that to which the old word fancy points, i.e. the imagination. Gallagher was no ideologue. He would not decide ahead of time who was worth speaking to in a crowd. His determination to move beyond cultural predeterminations lent him a largeur d'esprit that made him genial. This open-mindedness gave him the uncanny ability to pair up the oddest bedfellows. Dive Deeper thus offers the most outlandish dialogue pairings. Jane Austen and D.H. Lawrence, Flannery O'Connor and George Eliot, William Shakespeare and Oscar Romero, Rahner and Rilke, and most strikingly of all, Thérèse de Lisieux and Friedrich Nietzsche. It takes a pretty enlarged mind to make such pairs talk and listen to each other. Gallagher's ensuing imaginary dialogues have an eerie, conjuring power that certainly flesh out one of his favorite lines from Emily Dickinson. The possible's slow fuse is lit by the imagination. To make these pairs converse is not to stage mere intellectual fencing. It is to call these convinced men and women and their disciples to leave their usual entrenchments, to be coaxed out of their caves, if you will, by the possibility of encountering a strangely heartwarming love. This is made more evident by the dialogue which closes and crowns Dive Deeper, an inner conversation between the self and Jesus, where postmodern self-centeredness is drawn through its frailty and limitations to a burning encounter with God's incarnate, down-to-earth mercy. If one stops to think about Gallagher's drive toward enlarging the mind and making the imagination real, it is a true work of reconciliatio oppositorum, that to which the human imagination is called by our blessed Lord, who hath made both one, and breaking down the middle wall of partition, the enmities in his flesh, that he might make the two in himself into one new man. Enlarging the mind to receive the reality of a creation reconciled with itself and with the Creator. Diving deeper to receive this divine revelation and to make faith real. One feels that if two guests had broken out into a fistfight at one of Michael Paul's parties, he would have not called security to take them out. He would have broken up the fight with Irish wit and kindness and brought the warring factions to sit down, calmly speak their own, and listen to each other over a glass of good whiskey. A talent not easily found in our antagonistic age, and one that requires great personal convictions. Third point, duc in altum. It has become a trend in certain theological circles to single out hospitality as a hallmark of the gospel. In this vein, Michael Paul was one who would more obviously walk the walk than talk the talk. It should be quite obvious by now how hospitable his horizons were, if I may use clashing symbols, but Gallagher did not gather his guests to groom navel-gazing. Michael Paul, in my own experience, was a friendly man, a fraternal Jesuit, but also a fatherly figure who sometimes rather sternly forced me out of my natural and supernatural haunts. At my doctoral defense back in Paris, he brought up, while he was on the panel for the dissertation, not 10, not 12, but 11 points, which slightly jarred with me, being a little obsessive and also having this French thing for symmetry. But that was him, 11 points, and I'll draw you out of where you're standing right now. His involvement with the Paul VI Institute in Brescia reveals how close his mindset was to Papa Montini's tireless appeal to dialogue, as evidenced in the 1964 encyclical Ecclesiam Suam, or in the more dramatic negotiations for the release of Aldo Moro. More largely, Father Gallagher's Formamentis reveals how deeply he integrated the teachings of the Second Vatican Council and recent popes to try and enter into true, respectful dialogue with men, women, and children of every creed and culture. Many today claim openness in the name of Vatican II. Michael Paul really lived it out. Dialogue, in fact, is not a way for the weak. Father Gallagher's soft stubbornness in this realm betrays an especially graced use of that old Latin virtue, fortitudo, or courage, which few seem to possess entirely. He knew that men's minds will not be efficiently enlarged by rape and plunder. They are more effectively moved by a constant, courageous call to put out into the deep. I came to realize in recent weeks, as I plowed through Gallagher's numerous short volumes, that his invitation to imagine a world of new possibilities was addressed not only to non-believers, but also, and perhaps even more, especially in later years, to men and women steeped in Christianity from their youth. Whereas Christians might smugly consider that only the disbelieving should enlarge their minds to welcome the dogma and mores of the Roman Church, Gallagher, like Newman before him, also invited cradle Catholics to be real, as he jokingly put it. He knew that the great tides of cultural change were bringing everyone out of their depth. Yesterday's unquestioning believers would be tomorrow's comfortable agnostics, with high but often unspoken personal and social cost. Gallagher took stock of changing tides, and neither opposing them nor submitting to them unreflectively, sought to make the best of expanding horizons and sometimes dizzying currents. Having often lived by the sea, he knew that choppy waters sometimes offer the best fish. This is why my opening quotation from Henri de Lubac about our thoughts growing old does not apply, in my opinion, to the life and thought of Michael Paul. In a way, his thought stays youthful because its strength lies less in its material content than in its dynamic form and force. His youthfulness is linked to his playfulness and dynamism. This is not to say that Gallagher was creedless by any standard. With Ratzinger, although somewhat less explicitly, he rapped relativists. Christ, the reconciler, always stood at the center of his thought. In this sense, Gallagher is cut from the same cloth as Newman, with his dynamic idea of Christ, as Balthasar with his luminous Christ as image of all images, or as Karl Rahner with his sensible perception of Christ's spirit at work in the world. At the crossroads between faith and culture, Michael Paul left us a milestone, not just as a memorial of his own forays into the deep, but as an invitation to dive deeper ourselves. Faith itself, wrote Gallagher, is a God-given way of imagining existence, not a cold truth easily captured in concepts. And my conviction, he continued, is that the imaginative writers, like biblical prophets, can deepen our angle of seeing. Michael Paul never quoted poets for purposes of aestheticism, nor did he name-drop theologians to dazzle his readers. He strove calmly but vigorously so that everyone who crossed his path would leave with a deeper faith and a more realistic imagination, both more questioning and more trusting, paradoxically. The surface of things would not suffice where salvation was at stake. I would be remiss not to mention one final aspect of Michael Paul, his being a Jesuit. His knack for preaching and his wisdom in spiritual direction and conversation, as witnessed by many here at the Gregorian to me after his passing, testify to his faithful affiliation to the life and spirituality of St. Ignatius Loyola. One of Ignatius's key words is the Latin adverb magis, a word that has undergone a revival in recent years in the international youth ministry of the Jesuits. The word magis can be traced back to the second week of the spiritual exercises, in which the retreatant begins to contemplate the life of Christ. The grace to ask for in those contemplations is ut magis ipsum amem eumque sequa, or as the musical Godspell has it, to see him more clearly, love him more dearly, and follow him more nearly. This magis, this more, is a call to see, love, and follow Jesus with an increased intensity, with a larger mind, with a more real imagination. As a Jesuit, Michael Paul strove to live this out and bring others to do so, to live more intensely as Christ might want us to do. I think his invitation to us all to imagine and realize our lives according to the Ignatian magis finds great poetic expression in the well-known words of Jared Milne Hopkins, with which I conclude this paper. I say more. The just man justices, keeps grace, that keeps all his goings graces. Acts in God's eye what in God's eye he is, Christ. For Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs, and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father, through the features of men's faces. Thank you.